Did you know that over 2 million Africans died under French colonial rule alone? This is a story of forgotten crimes, massacres, and systematic oppression. We are diving into the dark history of colonial Africa, exploring atrocities that have been buried, downplayed, or outright ignored. From the late 19th century to the mid-20th, European powers carved up the African continent, leaving a trail of blood and destruction in their wake. France, for example, controlled over 35% of Africa. But territorial control came at a horrific price. Let's start with a massacre that signaled a fundamental shift in colonial rule, the Tavif Massacre. In June 1888, in the borderland town of Tavif, now part of Ghana, British colonial forces brutally murdered an estimated 800 people. This wasn't an isolated incident. It marked a turning point, signaling to African communities that negotiation was over, and lethal force was the new order. Now, let's move to Senegal, 1944. World War II had just ended, and Senegalese riflemen who had fought for France were returning home. These soldiers, many of whom had risked their lives for the French, demanded payment of their wage arrears. The response: the French army opened fire on the unarmed soldiers at Tayara military camp, near Dakar. A betrayal of the highest order. Next, we confront one of the most brutal episodes of colonial history, the Herero and Nomo genocide in German Southwest Africa, now Namibia. The seeds of this genocide were sown in 1903, with a dispute over the price of a goat. But the situation quickly escalated. In January 1904, German colonial leaders sent a telegram to Berlin claiming an uprising, even though no fighting had occurred. Kaiser Wilhelm II responded by sending Lieutenant General Lothar von Trotha as the new colonial governor. Von Trotha issued the infamous Vernichtungsbefehl, the extermination order. This was explicit racial extermination rhetoric, decades before the Nazi genocide. The order called for the complete annihilation of the Herero and Nomo people. German Southwest Africa was larger than Britain, France, and Germany combined, making the scale of this genocide all the more horrifying. The violence wasn't limited to large-scale massacres. In Chad, in 1899, a column led by Captains Voulet and Chenoin committed unspeakable atrocities as they moved east. Murder, rape, pillaging, village burning, these were their methods. Later, colonial troops assassinated the Agwet, the military chief of Dokom, and his men. 56 people were killed, along with over 20 Islamic scholars. These captains had already earned reputations for brutality during the conquest of the Mossi Kingdom, suggesting a culture of tolerance, or even encouragement, of extreme violence within the colonial administration. Gorée Island in Senegal is often remembered as a major departure point for slaves during the transatlantic slave trade. But the island's role continued well into the 19th century. Beginning in 1815, it was transformed into a slave trade hub, and millions of Africans were uprooted and enslaved, with hundreds of thousands perishing during transport. But the violence of colonialism extended far beyond massacres and enslavement. European powers employed systematic punishment methods to control and subjugate African populations. Executions, prison encampments, forced removals, penal labor, floggings, amputations, these were not aberrations, they were coordinated systems of control. Even after formal colonization, documented evidence shows that slave raiding continued into the early 1900s. For example, a raid on Kumra in Chad in 1903 saw Fub slavers capture thousands of people. This indicates that colonizers didn't eliminate slavery, but often co-opted or redirected it for their own purposes. The connections between colonial violence and later systems of oppression are undeniable. German Southwest Africa later came under South African administration, placing it under Dutch and British settler descendants who formalized apartheid in 1948. This created a direct lineage between German colonial genocide and systematic racial apartheid. The Tavif massacre marked a crucial moment. It was when European colonial administration shifted from negotiation to lethal force, signaling a fundamental change in the political order. The Herero and Norma extermination order represents one of the first documented instances of explicit racial genocide rhetoric in modern history, predating Nazi atrocities by decades. The Vernichtungsbefehl established a chilling template for state-sanctioned racial extermination. The sheer scale of death and destruction under French colonialism, with over 2 million lives lost, represents a generational population loss. This has had a profound impact on economic development, social structures, and cultural continuity across multiple African nations. Even today, post-colonial African institutions retain structures of violence inherited from colonial punishment systems. Violence became embedded in governance itself. So, what is the legacy of these colonial crimes? African nations are still grappling with the consequences. There's a growing reparations movement, demanding recognition of colonial crimes, reparations from former colonial powers, and formal apologies from European governments. The economic plunder during colonialism created wealth extraction patterns that persist to this day. Colonial-era trade route control evolved into modern economic dependency relationships. Modern African criminal justice, policing, and military structures often retain colonial-era punishment methodologies, perpetuating colonial power dynamics. But perhaps one of the most insidious legacies of colonialism is the suppression of historical memory. Most African populations lack detailed knowledge of specific massacres and atrocities. Colonial powers controlled historical narratives, and post-colonial governments often deprioritized colonial crime documentation. Casualty figures remain contested, and many atrocities went unrecorded or records were destroyed. Colonial powers often framed their violence as necessary pacification or development, obscuring systematic genocide as administrative necessity. This rhetoric continues to influence how colonial history is taught in some Western institutions. While Ghana-led UN resolution declared the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity in world history, this is only a start. The crimes of colonialism demand further recognition. They demand justice. They demand that we remember. The question remains, when will the world truly acknowledge and reckon with the full extent of these forgotten colonial crimes?